The casino? Or maybe the spa? No. Ludmilla glanced at her surroundings as the Sorcerer King considered the next destination of their tour. Her mouth opened and closed several times to ask about some of the locations, but it was probably a bad idea in their present company. Following the commotion caused by her attempted escape from the 9th floor, a not insignificant chunk of the royal household had attached themselves to the Sorcerer King's entourage. In addition to the homunculus maids who had been drawn by the noise, several masked footmen, some sort of bird-type heteromorph, and Master Tia now walked alongside them. Hemmed in as she was, Ludmilla felt like a random pedestrian who had been accidentally caught up in the crowd. How about we? No, I guess it's straight to the library, after all. Your Majesty, Ludmilla said, please do not inconvenience yourself for your servant's sake. My interests aren't anywhere near as exhaustive as those of a regular noble. Is that so? Well, I could still show you some things along the way. The sound of dozens of pairs of feet accompanied the whisper of the Sorcerer King's robes as they made their way up the grand staircase and through an even more grand corridor lined with the occasional exhibit. Most of it wasn't the art that conventional aristocrats and other elites would put on display. You seem to have taken an interest in our trophies, Lady Zaradnik, the Sorcerer King said. I suppose you're the militant sort, after all. Does your Majesty mean to say that these are trophies from past conquests? It wasn't as if she was interested in the trophies themselves, but such things usually came with an interesting story or two. This is from our first big win. The Sorcerer King stopped in front of a fang that was taller than a frost giant. He looked up at it with a measure of fondness, though Ludmilla wasn't sure how she could tell. A fang of the World Eater, a legendary dragon that once devoured countless worlds. Worlds? Is worlds being used metaphorically, Your Majesty? No, the World Eater is as it sounds. A being that devours entire worlds. Then I cannot imagine how such a being could be defeated, Ludmilla said. It was something like a rite of passage for us, the Sorcerer King said. That's why it's right at the beginning of the hallway. We had many more adventures that presented a far greater challenge. The Sorcerer King had mentioned having adventures before, but he never mentioned that some of them involved battling entities that could devour entire worlds. Then again, what else was a group of gods supposed to fight? It is fortunate that such a being no longer exists, Ludmilla said. Yes, well, I suppose the appearance of the World Eater would be quite troublesome here. Does your Majesty mean to say that it is possible? It was defeated once a week back in the day, the Sorcerer King replied. I doubt that would happen here, however. The circumstances are far too removed from back then. She struggled to wrap her head around the implications of his statement. Never mind that, everything about the information she had just heard existed in a realm beyond her comprehension. Was the world that she knew of one that had been saved from the World Eater? Maybe World Eater referred to an entire species of world-eating dragons. If so, it suggested an incomprehensible ecology where a plethora of worlds was born and eaten on a weekly basis. I suppose this is what they mean by ignorance is bliss. There was little point in knowing and nothing that she could do about it now that she did. All one could do was worry about a day when their entire existence ended up in a dragon's gullet. His Majesty doesn't seem to be worried about it, so he must have the means to defeat this World Eater even if it appears. As she comforted herself with that thought, the Sorcerer King stopped at another exhibit. A bloody urn emitting an evil aura rested upon a pristine white pedestal. This is a blood soul, he gestured at the urn. Its only known use is as a catalyst to evolve powerful vampires. The racial class that they ended up with wasn't very popular, though. Why not? Simply put, the Sorcerer King replied, vampires excel as physical combatants. Blood soul, however, gives access to a racial class that is, well, flavorful would be a nice way to put it. How should I explain? Tell me, what is the vampire lore in the region like? They seem to exist in the wild, but most of what I've heard from the local adventurers is practical. Their strengths, weaknesses, habits, and so on. Ludmilla resisted the urge to fidget under the Sorcerer King's gaze. The other lore surrounding vampires was fairly embarrassing to share aloud. Aside from what your Majesty mentioned, she said, it's very whimsical. Certain tales are popular with some women, ones where vampires dwell among the living. They seduce or enthrall hapless people to serve them, establishing covens in their favorite feeding grounds. Exactly. The Sorcerer King pointed an alabaster finger directly at her. Exactly that. In terms of a job class build, does that sound optimal? Asked. Not at all, Your Majesty, Ludmilla replied. When I think about it, it feels similar to what happens with the Imperial Knights or similar organizations. How so? The Imperial Knights only recruit humans, as far as I can recall. Your Majesty mentioned that vampires excel as physical combatants, Ludmilla said. Soldiers in the Imperial Army follow a similar course of progression. When an Imperial citizen enlists in the Imperial Army, the vast majority are trained as fighters. At some point in their career, an Imperial Knight is deemed experienced enough for a position of command and offered the opportunity to become a sergeant. Those who do so end up contaminating their job class builds. That is similar to what Your Majesty described, is it not? In reality, it was even worse for civilian vocations. Or, rather, it was the same, but the difference in scale was immense. The guild system promoted members out of its ranks based on the notion that those experienced in their craft also qualified them for leadership duties. Unfortunately, an excellent blacksmith did not make for an excellent leader or administrator. The Sorcerer King's beautiful finger curled slightly as she spoke. When she finished, he nodded slightly. Yes, I can see how it would seem similar to you. You are on the right track, but the problem here is likely worse than you imagine. Ludmilla felt a chill travel up her spine. Worse than falling away from the teachings of the gods? She reached out to clutch Lord Mayor by the arm. He was also trembling, but that was perfectly understandable for such a well-behaved boy. I fear the truth may be too much for me, Your Majesty, she said. An ominous chuckle rose from His Majesty's throat. To truly understand the depths of such a mistake, you must first understand how another trait of vampires works. The trait that I refer to is the ability to turn their victims into vampires. Regular vampires can only turn people into vampire spawn, that is, lesser vampires who don't even qualify as basic vampires. Needless to say, they have nowhere near the power of basic vampires while suffering even more from a vampire's weaknesses. Vampires evolve into true vampires, which have the ability to hold one powerful vampire under their dominion per level in True Vampire. Shaltir, for instance, has 10 levels in True Vampire, so she can dominate 10 powerful vampires. The racial class that this blood soul allows one to advance in, has abilities in line with the idea that the pinnacle of vampire kind will have a powerful coven to match. The maximum limit of powerful vampires that they control goes up and they become a special type of pet class. Do you see the problem yet? Ludmilla shook her head. If anything, it sounded like a useful trade-off if the vampires under the one's command were powerful enough. The Sorcerer King turned back around to regard the urn on its pedestal. The problem is that vampires must be turned. They are not summoned through a spell or class ability. An individual with the one must spend time going around selecting suitable vampire candidates. If they are lost for good. The longer a battle goes on, the more vampire minions the one loses, and they cannot be immediately replaced with new minions with the same characteristics. Thus, the one gradually loses all of its benefits in any serious battle. Since their commander-like abilities only work on their pets, they can't even act as a commander for their comrades. Most groups would rather bring a real commander or a real pet class, one that doesn't send the party on massive detours to replace lost pets. The way that the Sorcerer King described things did indeed make it seem like a problem, but was it truly one? Powerful vampires weren't so easily destroyed, and having a dozen or more of them running around would be an utter nightmare for a country. She imagined that such covens might be comfortably ruling the underworld of metropolises in various regions of the world. Maybe I should keep an eye out for that. There could very well be a powerful vampire living incognito in Riastais or the Empire. Are there many of these blood souls? Ludmilla asked. With how powerful vampires are relative to most of the world, it may be possible for an individual with the one to thrive. You may have a point there, but, no, it probably isn't possible. Blood souls can only be obtained by defeating Canabel. Ludmilla frowned slightly. Your Majesty, she said. I may be mistaken, but isn't Canabel the god that Lady Shaltir worships? Yes, that's right. His fight was just as flavorful as the one, but people stopped killing him after the novelty wore off since blood souls were so useless. The Sorcerer King moved on. Ludmilla was nearly trampled by the gaggle of retainers behind her as she digested the casual response. Gods can die, but they can also come back. People stopped killing Cainabel, so there's no reason to believe that he isn't lurking around somewhere. The first part made sense, as the great sin had proven to be a temporary outcome. The second part was only a problem if someone else could kill Cainabel, or was it a problem at all? Aside from landfall, vampires didn't have that terrible of a reputation. As Lady Shaltir and her handmaidens had shown, they could exist alongside the living in a peaceful, if aloof, manner. I have a somewhat related question, Your Majesty. A question, about Cainabel? It has to do with Your Majesty's vision of a nation where all races live in harmony and the legal realities that come with the realization of that vision. There will be a point where the rights and protections provided by the law end up at odds with the nature of one or more of our member races. The Sorceress Kingdom already counts many predatory species as its citizens, and there are races with other, even more exotic behaviors besides. At some point, the needs of those races will run into the limit of what the land is capable of providing. The King's peace being enforced upon the tribes in the Azalesian frontier and the Abelian wilderness, the burdens that it has placed upon the rest of the Sorceress Kingdom is an example of such limits being reached. Florine, who was very familiar with the issue, had expressed her concerns on several occasions. If it hadn't been for the defense of the Draconic Kingdom against the Beastman invaders from the east providing them with hundreds of thousands of fresh corpses, the carnivorous segment of the Sorceress Kingdom's population would have been facing crushing food prices or even an outright famine. Should the market not dictate such things? The Sorcerer King asked. The Sorceress Kingdom is working hard to expand its economic reach. Much of this effort is being spearheaded by our friends, is it not? That approach creates problems of its own, Ludmilla answered. The cost and availability of different types of food means that herbivorous and omnivorous races will end up becoming the majority of the population. This is especially the case since many of those races are quite fecund. These factors will inevitably influence culture, politics, and economic realities. Allowing the market to dictate food prices means that some races will simply be priced out of existence because other races can live on less. Humans were the most prominent case for their concerns. When it came to civilian economies, they had an inherent advantage against most other races in every industrial sector, were relatively fecund, and could have a very low cost of living compared to obligate carnivores. Racial advantages presumably allowed demi-humans to counter those advantages, but if they were subjected to unbreakable authority that forced them to compete using civil means, humans would surely come out on top. At least if they followed the teachings of our gods. No, if we're considered a primitive backwater, then the class system has to be well understood in some form in other parts of the world. Even in their primitive backwater, society had sorted out many aspects of the class system in its own way. One didn't have to have a perfect understanding of the system to make it work for them, and it gave too many clues to believe that people would simply remain ignorant of reality for countless centuries. Do you mean to say that, even if the law created provisions for the needs of different races, our citizens wouldn't respect them? I cannot say for certain how things will play out, Ludmilla replied, but I am of the mind that those who collectively benefit the greatest from Your Majesty's rule will dictate the development of the nation. If there are 100 herbivores for every carnivore, then the realities that come with that will determine the nature of the Sorceress Kingdom's industrial base and the attitudes carried by its culture. I see. The Sorcerer King turned his gaze down the corridor. Market forces, inertia? Something like that. Yes, Your Majesty, Ludmilla said. I don't believe that a term describing what I speak of as a whole exists in any of the languages that I know. Have you considered a solution to the problem? No, Your Majesty. I am still developing the understanding required to even consider a solution by experimenting with policy in my territory. However, progress in the Sorceress Kingdom is such that I fear the answers I seek will be meaningless by the time I finally obtain them. Meaningless? Perhaps meaningless is too strong a word, Your Majesty, Ludmilla said. What I meant to say was that we will be well on our way to certain outcomes, and the ways of thinking and perceiving the world associated with those paths will be thoroughly entrenched. Trying to change things in that situation, which will also presumably be considered successful, will be an impossible task. The Sorcerer King resumed walking in silence, as if pondering her words. Ludmilla was hoping that he already had an answer, but it didn't seem to be the case. The purpose of the administration is to find a way forward while addressing such issues, is it not? The Sorcerer King asked. Yes, Your Majesty, Ludmilla answered. This, however, brings me to a related set of concerns. Your Majesty has appointed undoubtedly excellent ministers to his cabinet, but the civilian administration tends to encourage maximizing industrial production. In particular, generating revenues for the crown seems to take priority above all else. They stopped in front of a 2-meter-wide golden disc that shimmered under a magical spotlight. It was covered in an unknown script and foreboding imagery depicting some sort of cataclysm befalling a city. What do you envision to be the outcome of what you've described? The prioritization of material gain, Ludmilla replied. A society driven by greed and desperation. The Baharuth Empire has already set itself on that path, and I cannot say that I liked what I saw of what they are becoming. If our people end up cultivating the same appetites, I can only see a legacy of aggressive expansion in our future. The security and economic base that the Sorceress Kingdom provides means that independent actors from our country can succeed even without the support of the royal court. Not that I expect the royal court to try and stop them. Those ventures will be bringing in the wealth that the administration seems to desire, after all. She couldn't for the life of her think of what they needed that wealth for. A regular country might use it to strengthen its economy or military, but the Sorceress Kingdom was so powerful that conventional means to build up national power were likely pointless. If this future concerns you, the Sorcerer King said, then why not propose legislation that will address these future issues? Because I would be the only one who supports any proposals that I make. Her friends might support her on one bit or the other, but they had their own fiefs to run. They wouldn't do anything they believed was detrimental to the future of their land and its people. Ludmilla's initial hope was that the leaders of the various demi-human tribes in the wilderness would involve themselves in the lawmaking process, but, so far, the membership of the House of Lords remained unchanged from the time of its very first assembly. Because the members of the House of Lords look forward to the progress that our future brings, Your Majesty, Ludmilla replied. One could say that this is a good thing considering how long it took for them to actively participate in running the country again, but the pendulum is swinging from one extreme to the other. Additionally, I don't think the House of Lords fairly represents the interests of the Sorceress Kingdom. The Sorcerer King turned his head to regard her with his crimson gaze. What are you implying, Lady Zaradnik? I am not implying anything, I am merely stating a fact. Humans make up less than 10% of the population of the Sorceress Kingdom, yet the House of Lords is 100% human. I don't think for a moment that the interests of non-humans are being fairly represented in the legislature. It's not even a matter of malice, our current aristocratic establishment simply doesn't have the knowledge or even awareness required to consider the interests of other races. The Sorcerer King nodded. Now that is something that can be presented as an issue which must be addressed. Albedo has already pointed out the difficulties in achieving fair representation in the House of Lords. However, demi-humans have their own barriers to participating in the governance of the realm. They do not understand and may not accept how our government works. Most of them can't even read. This is the reason why the Abelian Wilderness was turned into a special administrative area that is responsible for its regional affairs. Does Your Majesty mean to say that this particular problem is something that Her Excellency the Prime Minister already has well in hand? Among other things. It seemed that she had just wasted His Majesty's time. He was just kind enough to hear her out. Ludmilla fell silent, meekly following after the Sorcerer King as he continued reminiscing over the trophies in the hallway. She couldn't understand even half of what he spoke about, but the crowd around her was enraptured by his presentation. They sighed in wonder and applauded in glee. Even Lord Tian looked like he had been caught up in their excitement. Ludmilla supposed that someone as ignorant as herself couldn't appreciate the Sorcerer King's recountings to the same degree. Several hours later, they arrived at an impressive set of double doors. Rather than pass through directly, however, they stepped through a teleportation gate that delivered them to a hemispherical room. The walls were lined with fine statues and another set of double doors stood before them. On one door was carved a demon of some sort, while the other displayed an unknown female figure of divine bearing. The doors swung inward and the familiar figures of Miss Delta and Miss Sita appeared from behind them. They bowed low in welcome to the Sorcerer King. "We're on our way to the library," His Majesty said. "Is there anything that requires my immediate attention?" Miss Delta and Miss Zeta straightened from their greeting. Miss Zeta tilted her head slightly. "Nothing that I can think of, Lord Ines." "Excellent. In that case, let's move on." The absence of footsteps behind her made Ludmilla look over her shoulder. It appeared that the crowd that had formed on the 9th floor had remained there. "This is the throne room," the Sorcerer King told her. "It rarely sees any use these days, but we've received guests here in the past." They had turned toward a corridor at the beginning of the Great Hall, but Ludmilla could see to the end of it. The vaulted architecture supported a ceiling so grand that the lighting couldn't reach its heights. A flag hung from each pillar in the long colonnade leading to the dais on the far side of the hall, but she couldn't recognize any of them. "I wonder who they belong to. I don't see the symbols of any of the 6 great gods." She lost her view of the throne room as they entered the corridor. Before long, they entered a domed chamber with a set of double doors as large as the ones leading into the throne room. Comfortable-looking furnishings under warm lighting lined the walls, and a pair of impressive metal statues stood on either side of the double doors. "Open the doors," the Sorcerer King said. The 2 statues came alive and pushed the doors open a crack. That crack was large enough to fit 3 people shoulder to shoulder, and the Sorcerer King led them through. On the other side was a vast gallery where bookshelves formed the walls. Ludmilla gaped up at the vertical relief around her, wondering how many tomes it contained between all of its rooms and floors. "How many lifetimes of knowledge does this place contain?" she half said to herself. "Impressive, no?" the Sorcerer King said. "This is the great library of Ashurbanipal. While I can't say that all of the knowledge in the world is contained here, it can certainly feel that way. The library staff should be able to help you with your search. Gem, where have they disappeared to?" Ludmilla wished she could look everywhere at once as they made their way deeper into the library. The libraries of nobles and even kings were dwarfed by even a single chamber of Ashurbanipal. She wouldn't have enough time during her visit to get through a single shelf. It felt like she was one of the characters in the tales where one gained entrance to a library that contained all of the knowledge of the ancients, yet they were only allowed to read 1 page of one book. Any more than that and they were cursed, killed, or subjected to a fate worse than death. "That's strange," the Sorcerer King murmured. "Aura, can you detect any of the library staff?" "Let's see." Lady Aura frowned in concentration. Oh. Ludmilla looked down at Lady Aura with a frown. A moment later, she heard someone shuffling in the distance. "Master? Is that you, Master?" A white-robed figure came out from behind one of the bookshelves in the next wing over. He came straight towards them, his unkempt white hair flying wildly about a wizened head that made Ludmilla immediately want to avoid him. "A banshee?" "No, more like an Alip." "Master." Madness and desperation tainted the old man's voice. Ludmilla warily watched him as he closed the last few dozen meters, wrinkling her nose at his unpleasant odor. "Master." The old man shuffled to a halt. "Where did he go? I swear he was just here." Ludmilla turned her attention away from the crazy old man. To her shock, the Sorcerer King was gone. "I hope the recruits are cleaning themselves up properly after training." The thought dominated Ludmilla's mind as she struggled to maintain a straight face in front of the malodorous madman. Was he one of the librarians that the Sorcerer King had mentioned? Why did His Majesty disappear? At least he had taken Lady Aura and Lord Mayor with him. She wouldn't want any child near the questionable entity standing before her. Her wariness went up 3 more notches as the old man peered at her suspiciously. "You," he said as if he had just noticed her. "Was the master just here?" "If you are referring to His Majesty the Sorcerer King, yes." Turning his head this way and that, the old man scanned the surroundings again. Did he expect the Sorcerer King to be hiding behind a piece of furniture? "What does this mean?" the old man muttered to himself. "Is this a test?" "His Majesty was looking for a librarian to guide me," Ludmilla said. "So he wishes to see how familiar I've become with this vast repository of arcane lore," the old man nodded. "Very well. This way." With a wave of his hand, he turned and shuffled away. Ludmilla followed in silence, unsure if she should do anything to further destabilize the obviously deranged fellow. He could at least keep himself clean. For some reason, men never seemed to be aware of their odor until it was overpowering. Many a time in the past, she had to chase her family members into the river with a spear. There was no river here, however, and their exquisite setting only served to exaggerate the old man's stench. They entered a wing of the library where the colossal skeleton of a dragon-like creature was suspended from the frescoed ceiling. The robed man brought them to a long table of polished black wood, which had piles of books, scrolls, and parchments scattered across its surface. A glance at a few of the spines facing her showed that many of the books were written in the same script that Lady Shiltir used to take notes. "Tell me, child," he said. "Do you understand what is written upon these domes?" "I have seen some of this script on many occasions," Ludmilla replied, "but I am not learned in it." "Is that so? Then let us see if you are worthy of being our master's disciple." "Why am I a disciple now?" An adherent of Sursana could be considered a disciple of Sursana, but she was pretty sure he wasn't referring to that. A withered and bejeweled hand pushed a parchment across the table towards her. Its content was penned in local script, and the wording and structure indicated that it was written in Imperial. She frowned slightly as she read the parchment's whimsically worded content. "Isn't this a metaphorical portrayal of unified mana theory?" "So, you understand." Ludmilla looked up from the parchment. She was reasonably certain that he couldn't see through her noble's mask. Across the table, the old man's eyes gleamed with a crazed light. Maybe he simply imagined that she knew. She considered denying his assertion, but the way that he leaned slightly over the table suggested that he would crawl over to accost her if he didn't get the answer he wanted. "This is common sense, is it not?" Ludmilla shrugged. The old man made a choking sound. "See common sense? You dare mock me, child?" "I never intended anything of the sort," Ludmilla replied. "This is truly common sense, woven into the very fabric of society. An echo that reflects the reality of the world. Countless iterations exist, integrated into law, perception, and everyday life. Truth hidden in plain sight, so to speak." The old man stared at her, his face twitching in time with each of her sentences. Ludmilla resumed her reading as a long silence stretched between them. "Why?" a whisper came from across the table. "Why? Why have I been focusing on the wrong thing this entire time? Generations of research, for nothing?" A tear trickled down the old man's wrinkled face. "But you are so young. How did you know? Could it be that you are not as you appear? But to cheat death at that age, are you perhaps some prodigy from the great bastions of learning elsewhere on the continent?" It was a bit disconcerting how the old man occasionally struck upon the truth amidst his ramblings. Was he truly mad, or was it all a carefully calculated act? Common sense, hidden in plain sight. Yes, it is also clear now. Why did I not see it before? Cruel, so cruel in its simplicity. So much time and effort, lost. You must tell me more of what you know. I only really came to see if I could locate some research materials. If you could just point me in the right direction. Of course. I am more than happy to help. Let us speak while we conduct our search. With an energy that stood in stark contrast to his wizened appearance, he filled a satchel with blank paper and other writing materials. Ludmilla eyed the stuffed container curiously. "Is there a need for all that?" she asked. "Indeed," the old man nodded sagely. "The script employed here is complex beyond conventional reason. At first, I thought it based on ideographs of unknown origin, but then I discerned at least 3 other writing systems being used at the same time. It is most difficult to decipher. Even translation magic only works sporadically while offering gibberish and imagery with no known associations the rest of the time. This script was undoubtedly developed as a safeguard against the uninitiated. Isn't he overcomplicating things? Those who put on such airs seem to do that a lot, so it felt highly likely. "So," the old man said, "tell me what you know about the subject on that parchment." "Child, aren't you going to ask me about what I'm looking for, first?" "Oh, yes, what is it that you're looking for?" "I'm searching for material on rangers." Her guide's voice immediately turned distasteful. "Rangers? True practitioners of the arts do not concern themselves with such mundane occupations, or are you perhaps seeking information on alchemical ingredients? Mystical materials, perhaps?" "I can't say that I'm not interested in what you mentioned," Ludmilla said, "but I'd like to start from the beginning to mitigate the risk of missing something important." Taking the cautious approach, "I see," the old man said. "I hope you do understand that this may add decades or centuries to your search." Fortunately for her, the old man didn't seem to have any job classes with specialized communication abilities. A civilian noble would have probably taken offense at her reply and become far more difficult to deal with. "I would still rather take my time than make any mistakes," Ludmilla said. "What aspects of the subject that you shared with me are you studying?" "Aspects? The old man's gnarled fingers came up to pinch the bridge of his nose. I wasn't aware that there were aspects. Not specifically. If I were to name one, it would be in the fields of necromancy and one of the greatest taboos known to magic. Well, I cannot say what is and isn't known to magic, so what about the necromantic aspects? It is an old project of mine, the old man sighed. One that I haven't been able to make any headway in for years. I was trying to develop a spell capable of commanding powerful undead such as Death Knights and Elder Liches. I admit it was just as much for the sake of the Empire's national power as it was for my own interests, but I suppose it doesn't matter now. The Empire? Ludmilla assessed the strength of the old man. He was stronger than the Royal Army's Elder Liches. As far as she knew, only one magic caster in the Empire's history had ever achieved that level of power. Should I bring it up? Probably not. Freyan provided some details about the rapid decline of the head Imperial Court Mage's power and influence in the Empire. While they weren't in the Empire, her recognition might put him on the defensive. Veering into any Baharuth-related topic in depth was likely to remind her why she disliked the man, anyway. If you were a necromancer who dwelt in the Empire, Ludmilla said, the Katsa Plains would have surely been the ideal laboratory to study the primal mechanisms behind necromancy. One would think so, but the Empire is a very practical place. They are more interested in suppressing the propagation of the undead, and it was difficult to justify any long-term studies within that negative energy zone. So they only value the application of knowledge rather than the exploration of it. Precisely so. Fluda Paradine grew animated. The court council was always budget this and risk that. We will never know how far the Empire might have gotten if they had thrown open the doors of knowledge instead of gingerly opening it a crack once in a while. Did he simply assume that she knew who he was? One might have thought it reasonable considering how famous he was throughout the region, but it wasn't as if his name came with a painting. As the country's leadership, it seems perfectly reasonable for the court council to take precautions. There are precautions and then there are precautions. The wizard's voice turned sour. In the case of necromantic studies, it was mostly political. They feared that the temples would turn the people against the imperial administration if they discovered that we were dabbling in necromancy, out of the fear that we would serve as the catalyst of an undead calamity. Complete and utter rubbish. I would agree with you if you were working with tier magic, Ludmilla said. But other avenues do carry a real risk. Other avenues, Fluda stroked his beard. I haven't heard any mention of those in a very long time. What avenue in particular are you referring to? Anything that influences the gradient of primal energies in an area, Ludmilla replied. Established equilibriums are difficult to upset, but, once they are, one may not appreciate the new equilibrium that manifests, nor would he enjoy the process that leads to it. Also, the wizard's stench came closer. You stopped walking. Fluda looked up at her in confusion for several seconds before turning around to move again. Was he even looking for what she had asked about? So this primal energy you speak of is related to the nature of souls? Consider how regions with sharp elemental gradients manifest beings related to the dominant form of primal energy, Ludmilla said. Elementals reflect the nature of their element, do they not? They are merely agents of the whole that are capable of enacting change upon the world. Oh, I believe I see the connection that you're making. Fire elementals enacting the will of fire, is that right? That is one way to put it. Agents of the whole, parts of the whole, meaning that they are fundamentally one and the same, but to what end? Fire acts as fire does, Ludmilla told him. It is simply nature. I found that the easiest way to consider things is not as will, but as ecology. The wizard brought across the entry hall of the library and to the wing beyond it. There, they ascended to the second floor, walking past a giant model of some sort of sailing vessel. It had such a whimsical design that it was hard to believe it could be functional. Its sails swept out like wings, giving it an arrow-like shape. Tiny humanoid figures stood upon the deck and went about their tasks in brief loops, and she estimated that the vessel would have been nearly a kilometer long if built to full scale. Considering things as an ecology is too haphazard, Fluda said dismissively. Imprecise. To develop a better understanding of any phenomenon, one should break it down into its basic components. Superfluous and inefficient parts can then be removed, making everything better. Being able to understand every piece of a puzzle and reshape them to one's will is the essence of mastery. I suppose a country like the Empire is what happens when you have someone like this influencing its direction. Then is this why you pursue your studies? Ludmilla asked, to use your findings to reshape the world to your will? Knowledge itself is the goal, the wizard raised a finger, for I seek the abyss of magic. Where have I heard that before? Out of curiosity, Ludmilla said, do you perform any official functions here? Official functions? Yes, in fact. The master appointed me as the head of magic item development in the Sorcerer's Kingdom. Ludmilla glowered at the old man's back. No wonder he sounded so familiar. How is that coming along? She asked. There isn't much worth mentioning. The wizard's hunched shoulders rose and fell in a shrug. The citizens of the Sorcerer's Kingdom know naught of the wonders of Nazarick, nor have they cultivated an appreciation for the arcane. The Sorcerer's Kingdom has officially existed for less than 2 years, Ludmilla noted. Don't you think it's unreasonable to expect drastic change in so short a period? If only that were the sole problem, Fluda snorted. I am facing resistance to my efforts to advance the cause of arcanistry throughout the realm. The savage demi-human tribes may be forgiven for their ignorance, but even the so-called aristocrats of Erantle are refusing to embrace true civilization. Would you care to elaborate on that last part? As far as I know, the aristocracy is compliant with the Sorcerer's Kingdom's domestic policies. Fluda stopped and turned to face her. A resentful look shadowed his features. Compliant, yes. That is what I was told. But, for some inexplicable reason, the Sorcerer's Kingdom was founded using the laws of Reasties. Therein lies the problem, that primitive nation has absolutely no legislation that will help me in my cause. These nobles are compliant because nothing says that they aren't. New legislation must be enacted, but the power to do so lies in the hands of the very aristocrats who bar the path to progress. It seemed that the head of magic item development was an honorary title, at best. She always wondered why the missives she received from him always lacked any sort of weight. In his infinite wisdom, the Sorcerer King had appointed the former head Imperial Court Mage to a powerless position. Have you considered cultivating an interest in arcanistry amongst the population? Ludmilla asked. That is where the path to legal adoption begins, after all. I have, the wizard answered, but I've achieved minimal, if any, success. The nobles in the West aren't interested, much like their counterparts in Reasties. Countess Jesn ignores my attempts at correspondence outright. Countess Wagner is a merchant through and through. She seeks to use magic as a shortcut to profit. In the south, Countess Corlin pours all of her support into social programs and the growth of the temples. I cannot comprehend why she would embark on such emotional and wrong-headed ventures. Ludmilla idly entertained the notion of flipping Fluda off of the balcony. It probably wouldn't work since she didn't know any arcane casters who didn't have flight magic if they were capable of learning it. Maybe she could tie his beard to the railing. The worst of them all is Zaradnik. Oh? Ludmilla arched an eyebrow. What did she do? Too much. The wizard grated. She was quick to take advantage of what the Sorcerer's Kingdom offered, and, using her newfound wealth and power, she managed to lure the majority of the duchy's arcane casters to her territory. How concerning. Did she dispose of them out of superstitious fear? She presumably recruited them to develop local industries such as alchemy and item enchantment. There's even a rudimentary academy being set up there. That sounds like just the thing you need to set things in motion, Ludmilla said. Why are you making her efforts sound like an obstacle? Fluda sighed and rested an arm over the nearby railing. Oh, I had high hopes for her, I admit, he said. But she ended up being the same as Countess Corlin. Social welfare sits at the top of her list of priorities. She has all of those precious mages that she's stolen away working to create magical lighting, temperature regulation items, and other knickknacks to improve the quality of life of her subjects. It is a complete waste of so much magical talent. But wouldn't it cultivate an appreciation for the arcane? Change takes time. This seems like a good way to ease people into it. Her methods are far too passive, Fluda told her. She has all the resources and power she needs to force things through, yet she refuses to use it. It is infuriating to witness. Strong leaders like Jerkniv are necessary for true progress. Instead, I have a gaggle of widows and orphan girls to work with. To be fair, Ludmilla offered, they are former nobles of Reasties. The humans of Reasties and the Empire aren't too far removed from those savage demi-human tribes that you mentioned previously. The wizard settled down slightly. He let out a rasping chuckle as he stroked his beard. Not far removed, To you and I perhaps. But you must understand that, for generations, I have dedicated my life to guiding the Empire along the right path. I have heard it all before. The excuses, the reservations, the politicking, superstition, and fear. To my great regret, I was too soft with the Empire. Like an overindulgent parent, I let them do things their way. By the time my boy Jerkniv appeared to cleanse the Empire and set it back on the right course, it was too late. Too late. Fluda shook his head sadly and resumed walking. Ludmilla stared at his back for a moment before following him, wondering what he meant. You appeared in the Empire for a specific purpose, she said. An individual of your capabilities could have the ear of any country. One with far greater wealth and industry. An advanced country that would be more receptive to your guidance. Why did you decide to embark on your venture in a region of the world that was so recently razed to the ground? That is precisely the reason why I came, Fluda replied. You've listed several benefits of establishing myself elsewhere, but they are, in reality, liabilities. Obstacles. Institutions establish order and the powers that be become entrenched in their thinking. Better to start anew. A blank slate, so to speak. Unfortunately, it wasn't exactly an original idea. The Vaself horde came sweeping in from the ruins of Carnassus and the theocracy was quick to capitalize on the situation, as well. The Great Seeding, you mean? Fluda smirked. A rather hopeful way to frame the cannibalization of a smoking carcass, don't you think? Well, we all know how that turned out. The wizard's steps turned considerably lighter, as if the result amused him. He turned down a row of bookshelves, finally stopping at a section seemingly indistinguishable from any other. If my memory serves me correctly, here we are. Sheets of paper rustled as Fluda rummaged through his satchel. He produced a small booklet and licked a finger before leafing through its contents. Ludmilla examined the spines of the books on the shelves as the wizard muttered to himself. She had a poor sense of value, but she thought that every one of them looked priceless. A lot of these books are identical to one another, she said. Does that mean they're volumes in the same set? That would be the logical conclusion, Fluda replied absently. But, this library is quite devious. I found that the majority of the tomes stored here are replicas of one another. Replicas? Ludmilla furrowed her brow. Everything here looks incalculably valuable. A testament to the unfathomable reality of this place. Books that would beggar entire empires are used as decoys to distract thieves from the true treasures hidden among them. What do these treasures look like? Who knows? When I first gained entry to these esteemed halls, I hungrily seized upon anything that hinted at knowledge of the arcane. Now, you come by and ask for books concerning rangers. Perhaps everything in this great library of Ashurbanipal is a treasure to someone. Over the next few hours, Fluda indicated a dozen books that were potentially related to her search. She brought them over to the nearest table, wondering how she should proceed. Thank you for your help, Ludmilla said. Would you like to share a late meal with me? I suppose it wouldn't hurt, the wizard replied. I haven't had a meal in over a week. You are using magic to skip meals? Meals take up precious time. As does sleep. In this case, if we could continue our discussion from before, I wouldn't consider it a waste. Ludmilla silently pondered whether the invitation had been a mistake. She was hoping to get him to help translate some of the text. For Fluda's part, he looked like he didn't have a care in the world as she laid out the dishes. I take it you're used to having an apprentice see to your personal needs back in the Empire? Or did you keep household servants? Apprentices, the wizard didn't look up from his reading. Household servants weren't authorized to enter the Ministry of Magic. Gushmund was the last before I left. Before that, it was Noya. Did you always choose female apprentices to serve as personal attendants? Of course. Of course. That should have probably been expected. Even mundane vocations were the same way. For some stupid reason, she thought that a place of higher learning might stray from social mores. A frown crossed her lips as Fluda reached for a roll of bread. I assume you have the clean spell or something similar. Not at all, the wizard replied. I have no time to spend learning unnecessary spells. Now, you were saying something about the Katza Plains being an ideal laboratory? Negative energy is one of the primal energies of the world. Ludmilla finished laying out their meal and sat down across from her guide. And it just so happens that phenomena related to negative energy are quite distinct to those who exist on the opposite axis. Namely, the living. I see, Fluda nodded. That much is true. But what observations did you expect us to make? What do they have to do with what we discussed? Ludmilla considered her response. She had chosen the topic of negative energy since she had more experience studying it than any other form of primal mana, but she also didn't want to give too much away. Don't you think that the manifestation of undead entities is similar to the manifestation of elementals and other natural spirits? You are not the first to bring this comparison to my attention, the wizard said. There is a notable difference in these manifestations, however. Namely, the vast majority of undead entities are mindless, lacking in sentience and sapience. Thus, it stands to reason that they do not possess a soul. What of those that aren't mindless? Elder liches and vampires, for instance. The conventions would state that they possess souls. Then take my use of ecology, Ludmilla said. Positive energy also has an ecology, one that living beings consider natural. Living ecologies similarly have entities that are considered mindless and thus without souls. Even so, they are born through natural processes. They are born through processes considered natural by the living. Once again, we are speaking of primal energies. Negative energy is as much a part of our world as positive or elemental energy is. The manifestation of wild undead is a natural process. So the manifestation of powerful, intelligent undead beings is effectively the formation of a soul through a process that employs negative energy. If one pursues this avenue of thought, we may conjecture that this process may be usurped with the assistance of the arts to enact a most intriguing transformation. I must explore this. Without another word, the wizard rose from his seat and left. Ludmilla stared at the half-eaten roll on the table. Hopefully, she had the right books.